Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us. Thank you for your patience on the technical difficulties, but we're really glad you're here. We'd like to present to you our draft Cottage Grove and Dorena Lakes Master Plan and Environmental Assessment. My name is Wendy Jones, and I'd like to just welcome you on behalf of the Army Corps to this meeting. Dan, can you go to the next slide, please? All right, so a few logistics. I know we worked on this already a little bit. There's a few people that have called in audio only. If you are called in through the WebEx and you can see the screen, obviously you wouldn't be able to hear me to know, but if you have audio issues, there is that phone only option. We are going to record this and post it online, and we will have an opportunity for questions and answers after the presentation. And so at any time during this meeting, you can type questions into the chat, and we'll go through all of those after the presentation. The chat button is in the lower right-hand side of your screen. And please note that we are not using this chat feature for official comments on the master plan. We will ask that you email them or mail them into us. Next slide. So here's our agenda for today. We'll be having two other presenters from the Army Corps, and then I'll be back to present the last section where we get into the specific details for the Cottage Grove and Dorena Lakes Master Plan. Next slide, please. So thank you again for joining us today. We do have multiple Army Corps staff that are in this meeting, and they helped work on the plan. They will introduce themselves before they present or at the end before they answer the questions. I'd also like to point out some of our partners, especially at Dorena Lakes. We do have Lane County Parks. They manage the Baker Bay Park, and the Bureau of Land Management manages the Row River Trail. All right, and at this time, I'd like to turn it over to Eric. And Eric, you're muted right now.
You'd think after years of this, I would get it right. I'm sorry, everyone. My name's Eric Peterson. I'm the Operations Project Manager for the Willamette Valley and Rogue Basin projects, and I lead the team of people out in the field who operate and maintain the facilities and provide stewardship for the land and water and cultural resources out in the field. Purpose of today's meetings to provide you all an update. Nayla, it looks like you've got a hot mic there. Provide you all an update of where we're at with the master plan. It's been several years of work on the master plan for Cottage Grove and Dorena. We're looking for public and agency input on anything that may jump out at you that causes concern or that you'd like to see changed in this kind of near final stage. And also we want to facilitate, just provide this opportunity to continue the dialogue between the public that we serve and the people who are managing the resources. So in that respect, adhering to the kind of the guidelines that Wendy laid out will help ensure full and open participation. I know later we can use the chat to ask questions, and we can hopefully have some dialogue. We had a really good turnout on Saturday in the meeting that we had down there in person in Cottage Grove, as it was raining really hard outside, but gained some perspective there. I know that we got the right people in the room to answer questions, and if there are people who have other questions that are not germane to the master plan, I'll do my best to be available to field those questions with you as well. Next slide, please. All right, so I'm sure that you who have an interest in this system understand that the Willamette Valley is a system of 13 dams. We have 9 hydroelectric power plants in the valley as well, and our principal purpose is managing for flood risk in the valley. We take by providing temporal storage in the winter months, we provide for some pretty significant flood risk management benefits. This last weekend was an example of that. Even with storing water in Cottage Grove and Dorena, we had some pretty high flows in the South Valley and where the creeks and rivers were not impounded or not managed by our system, some of those local areas flooded pretty severely over the weekend. We operate this as a system. So as any systems approach, if you pull on one part of this system, if you affect one part or change one part, it has bearing on the rest of the system. And that in particular relates to water management for us. And we do balance always between competing authorized purposes, flood risk management, hydroelectric power, navigation, water quality and supply, and recreation and fish and wildlife. I often hear from people, hey, you know, if you knew we were going to have a wet or a dry spring, why didn't you save more water in the wintertime so that we could have full pools? And we're just always trying to balance risk, and our forecasts are really good for a few days out, but beyond that, they're pretty speculative. And as we saw this last weekend, conditions can change in a hurry, especially when we're in refill mode like we are right now. Next slide. All right, there's a lot going on in this system. In November of 22, we released a draft environmental impact statement, and we've been working on finishing that environmental impact statement for continued operations and maintenance of this system to incorporate a biological opinion from the National Marine Fisheries Service and another one from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We're a little ways out from that record of decision due to some subsequent legislation that we got in early January, but we're getting close. And that document really kind of highlights the trade-offs between competing demands and outlines what we need to do to be able to move forward and continue to operate and maintain the system and be covered by the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. We've had an injunctive near-term operational measures. That was a consequence of litigation. We were enjoined in litigation by the Northwest Environmental Defense Council and others in 2019. The court found in favor of the plaintiffs and granted injunctive relief, which included a couple of deep drawdowns, changes to how we manage Cougar Reservoir, changes to how we manage the Middle Fork, and also the South Sandy Am. And that has bearing on refill and the overall quantity and quality of water that we provide other times of the year. A number of those near-term operational measures were incorporated into the biological opinion and into the draft environmental impact statement that we expect to be complete probably later this year. And then on January 4th, the Water Resources Development Act of 2020, the Water Resources Development Act of 2024 was signed, and that requires us to look at operation of this system without generating hydroelectric power. So kind of a big shift at the last minute to this EIS. That was follow-up to a 2022 Water Resources Development Act requirement that caused us to look at the federal interest in continued operation of hydropower in the valley. So lots going on. All of these issues are fairly significant issues affecting how we manage water and how we manage for fish in the valley moving forward. And I think I'm going to turn it over to Christy to continue on with talking a little bit about the revisions that we made to the master plan and help facilitate the conversation around that. Christy, over to you.
All right, thank you, Eric. So as Eric said, my name is Christy Johnson. I am the lead park ranger in the Willamette Valley Project, and I'm going to talk about what a master plan is and why we're revising them now. Now, some of you might have attended our public scoping meetings a few years ago and may have got some of this overview already. But if you're new to master plans, I want to make sure you understand, what they are before you go and read it and get comments. So big picture, we are actually updating 6 master plans for the valley, one for each watershed. And so our goal is to continue picking up a new plan every year or so, with each plan taking about 2 years to complete. We started updating the master plan. We started this process in 2020, and we took a valley-wide approach. And we started out meeting with our recreation partners to discuss current and future goals. So those partners include Linn County Parks, Lane County Parks, Marion County Parks, Oregon State Parks, the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, the Forest Service, and the BLM. So we met with all those agencies because they all manage recreation around the reservoirs. We also reached out to other partners that use federal land, and that would include utility companies, road departments, and railroads. So once we got input from all of those partners, then we began updating the first master plan in 2021. We actually started the Cottage Grove and Dorena Lakes master plans back then, and those 2 lakes are in the Coast Fork watershed. So as I said, we're doing it watershed by watershed. And then in 2022, we started concurrently working on the master plan for Foster and Green Peter Lakes, which are in the South Sandium watershed. We hope to be complete both those plans this spring. The Cottage Grove and Dorena one took a little bit longer because we were still kind of working out how to go about revising these plans. But now we're moving along, and we'll be starting the next plan, which will be the Fern Ridge master plan in the Longtom watershed. Well, we actually just started on it this month. After Fern Ridge, we'll move on to the Middle Fork Willamette watershed and the lakes that are in that area. Next slide. So what is a Corps of Engineers master plan? So these documents are future planning documents that will guide our management for the next 20 to 25 years. They explain how we are currently managing recreation and natural and cultural resources, and they also establish a vision for the future management of these areas. And I don't know if Eric explained it. Sometimes we like to mention that the word project is used by the Corps of Engineers in different ways. So the common way, which is a project, something that you're working on, but we also use the word project to define the dam and reservoir. So we might say the Cottage Grove project or the Dorena project. And that term comes from when the dam construction project was first authorized by Congress. But so if we say it that way, we mean the lake and the reservoir together is the Cottage Grove project. Next slide. So what does a master plan address? So it describes the resources and then it sets goals to manage the resources. And those resources include recreation, interpretation, fish and wildlife, cultural resources, vegetation, water and wetlands, and mineral resources. Next slide. So what does a master plan not address? It does not address dam operations. So it does talk a little bit about how water is managed in relation to all the other natural and cultural and recreational resources, but it doesn't go into detail about lake elevations, downstream flows, water quality parameters, or fish passage requirements. So earlier when Eric was talking about the operations and management EIS that we're working on, that document, which is thousands of pages long, addresses those aspects of water management for all 13 dams. Next slide. So why are we updating the master plans now? Well, it's important for master plans to be updated periodically so that they remain relevant. These plans, the Cottage Grove and Dorena plans, are now over 35 years old, and a lot of things have changed during that time. So when we do the revision, we're going to address various things. One of them is changes in land use. So since 1989, things were using the land differently. An example of that is that probably many of you are familiar with the multi-use path that's managed by the Bureau of Land Management, the Row River Trail. Well, back in 1989, that was still an old railroad track. So definitely some change in land use there. We've also had changes in the regulations. So there may be a new federal mandate that we have to manage for, or there could be a change in endangered species status for a plant or animal since 1989. And so that's going to be updated in the plan. There's also been change in how people recreate. Across the United States, people are buying larger RVs, larger boats, and also paddle sports have become much more popular since the 1980s. So the master plan considers how to adapt our recreation facilities to accommodate those different types of recreation. And then lastly, there's been a lot of changes in environmental conditions. So I'll talk more about that on the next slide. So as you've probably noticed in recent years, the climate has become a lot less predictable. I'm sure all of you experience, well, maybe unless you've moved recently to the area, you may have experienced the snowpocalypse, which especially was heavy, had a lot of heavy impacts in the Cottage Grove area. And then more recently, the ice storm. So we are seeing a lot more kind of unusually extreme snow events and rain events, and they tend to come later in the spring than they might have in the past. We also have been experiencing a lot more summer droughts and more severe droughts, and that obviously affects our summer water levels in the reservoirs. And for those of you that can't see the pictures, I have a photo here of Wilson Creek Ramp in August 2021, where the bottom of the ramp is totally exposed and there's no way for boats to use, well, you could maybe launch a kayak, but you could definitely not have launched a motorboat in that August 2021. And we had never seen that before that year. I had never seen that extreme situation. And then also the droughts often lead to increased wildfire risk. And we have seen a lot, those of you that have lived in this area know we've seen lots of wildfires in the last, especially last 5 to 10 years. And there's a photo here that shows the Row River Trail where we had some fire damage in August of 2023. So that one really hit close to home because it actually burnt core property. Another thing that we have this change is we have a better understanding of cultural resource management, and that would be managing our archaeological and historic resources. So since in recent years, we've hired a team of archaeologists that have been helping to protect those resources. And we also are partnering more closely with the tribes to better implement our trust responsibilities. I'm going to talk a little more about cultural resources later. We also, as Eric mentioned, we've been doing a lot of work on recovering endangered fish species, and that's to change the way that we operate many of the dams. So although Cottage Grove and Dorena Dam operations are not expected to change significantly in the future, and actually in the EIS there are no proposed operational changes to those dam operations, because the Willamette Valley reservoirs are operated as a system. If we change operations at other dams and reservoirs, then it could affect Cottage Grove and Dorena Dam operations. For example, if we had a really dry year and there was not enough water in the river system, water could be released from Cottage Grove and Dorena dams to help meet those fish requirements. Another change since 1989 is the Black Butte Mine site, which is upstream of Cottage Grove Lake, has been designated as a Superfund site. And the cleanup area includes Cottage Grove, the reservoir of Cottage Grove Lake. And last thing is a power plant has been operated to Dorena Dam since 1989. I think it was put in 2014. It is a private power plant, and it doesn't really affect the operations of the dam, but it did take up a little area of land that formerly been added to the map. Wendy will talk about that later. Next slide. So now I'm going to provide a short summary of the existing resources and natural resource management mission at Cottage Grove and Dorena. This is, if you read the master plan or flip through the master plan, you will see kind of an overview of these areas. So for recreation management, our mission is to provide safe and enjoyable recreation opportunities for the public. Each year, over 250,000 visitors come to Cottage Grove and Dorena Lakes to enjoy boating, swimming, fishing, hunting, camping, walking, bird watching, and other outdoor activities. At Cottage Grove, we have 2 campgrounds, 2 boat ramps, and 4 day use areas. And Cottage Grove Lake is unique among the core reservoirs because we actually manage all of the recreation sites around Cottage Grove Lake. And at all of the other reservoirs, we have recreation partners, other agencies like county, state, that manage some of the recreation. But at Cottage Grove Lake, the Corps manages all of them. At Dorena Lake, we have 2 campgrounds, 2 boat ramps, and 3 day use areas. At Dorena, the Corps manages most of the recreation areas except for Baker Bay Park and Marina, which is operated under a 50-year lease agreement with Lane County Parks. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the BLM manages the Row River Trail, which goes along the north shore of the lake. Next slide. So our natural resource management mission is to protect and enhance the environment. And our revised master plan will define ways to balance recreational use and operational needs while still fulfilling the environmental stewardship mission. There are a variety of habitat types at the lakes, including conifer forest, prairie, rocky meadow, riparian forest, the lake, and associated streams and wetlands. Within the core managed areas at these lakes, there are 17 known sensitive plant and animal species that we are trying to protect. We also do habitat restoration, which includes prairie restoration and invasive plant removal, and also we do some prescribed burning at Dorena Lake. And finally, we have a boundary management program, which includes routine monitoring of the boundary, the federal boundary, in order to address trespass and encroachment issues that can negatively affect the resources. Next slide. So now I'm going to talk about cultural resource management, and our mission is, with our cultural resource management program, is to protect and preserve archaeological sites and artifacts, and also historic built resources, which includes the dam, but also historic sites like, so I was going to mention that when we built the dams, it inundated, of course, an area of land that had towns in them. The towns were moved, but there's leftovers of the towns out there, and there's also things left behind by people that have lived in the area for a very long time. So our goal is to protect those resources, and the master plan doesn't include a lot of detail about cultural resources because there is a separate document called a cultural resource management plan that is being developed for each lake. And well, actually there was one, and they're being updated now as well. So the archaeologists that work for the Corps will survey and monitor existing archaeological and historic sites, and that helps us reduce impacts from construction and maintenance activities. And in addition, the Corps is using education and enforcement to deter damage and theft of these resources. And right now we're really, the rangers are out there trying to help people understand that it is illegal to collect anything from Corps land, not just artifacts, but rocks or anything that you might find on Corps property. And the reason why it's not permitted is that it's possible that you could be accidentally or unintentionally disturbing an archaeological or historic site. So collecting of any kind is not permitted. So that's my little ranger commercial message. And I will pass on to Wendy to provide more details about the revised master plan.
Thank you for that, Christy. So as Christy mentioned earlier, there's a number of us that have been working on this since 2020. It's quite a long time. And we're very, very happy to get you a draft plan today. We know that we couldn't have done this alone. We've had a lot of help along the way. Thank you to all of you who came to the scoping meetings and filled out the surveys and provided us information. A few of the common topics we heard are on the screen there. And we are very grateful to all of the agencies and tribes and stakeholders that attended meetings and field trips and reviewed earlier versions of the documents and provided feedback for us to improve the document. And so we are very happy to have this plan today, but we also know that our work is not done. So that makes your comments and feedback even more important at this stage. We really want you to review the document and provide any ideas or suggestions you have to improve it. We may not know all the impacts or all the details for these areas. So if you see something missing, please let us know. I do want to remind you, we're not going to accept comments through the chat feature. You will have to mail or email in your comments, but I want you to use that chat feature as I present on the specific details for Cottage Grove and Dorena, and then we'll be able to answer questions afterwards. It's fine if you have questions that aren't related to the master plan. We'll try to answer those as well after the presentation. Next slide, please. So I have two slides where I just want to talk about the plan organization. And that's what you're seeing here, chapter by chapter. And on the next slide, I'll talk about some of the terminology. So when I get into specifics, it'll make more sense. So chapter 2 is a fairly large section. The slides Christy showed on natural resources, recreation, and all the cultural resources, those are really outlined in chapter 2, along with other sections on wetlands and a little bit of dam operations. It also will cover the real estate and just all of the background information for Cottage Grove and Dorena Lakes. The slides that I'm going to present today include maps from chapter 4 and also a lot of detail from chapter 8, which is a summary from our 1989 plan and our proposed 2025 plan. I also want to point out chapter 5, that's probably the longest section of the document. That's where it's going to go through every single management unit, one by one. There will be maps, there will be future management needs, any special considerations for each unit. So a lot of detail you can find in chapter 5. And then the environmental assessment is the appendix A to the document. Next slide, please. Okay, so what I want to cover are the proposed changes to both the land use and water use classifications. The classifications that you see on the screen, these are prescribed by Army Corps of Engineer regulations. And so I'll define each one of those briefly now. Operations, that includes the dam itself, any spillways, the park ranger office, or any maintenance areas. High density recreation, those would be your campgrounds, parks, marinas, day use areas, places that have a lot of infrastructure to support recreation. Mitigation is a classification that we're not using. There were no lands that were acquired specifically for mitigation in the Willamette Valley. And then the environmentally sensitive area, that's a new classification that we're using at Cottage Grove and Dorena, and that can be for any biological, cultural, ecological, or aesthetic value. And then the last classification is multiple resource management lands. So for any of these areas, you could have multiple uses, but you have to pick one primary use for each piece of land. Multiple resource management can include low density recreation, so more passive uses like hiking, fishing, hunting. Wildlife management is usually for some type of fish or wildlife resource management. Vegetation can be for stewardship of forests or prairies or other natural vegetation cover. And then the future or inactive recreation, those are lands that were either previously parks or they have the characteristics that could be developed for parks, and they're set aside with that category. When we get to the water surface classification, those will make a little bit more sense on the maps. but essentially it's either open to boating or it has a designation of restricted with no public access on the water, or a no wake zone. The Fish and Wildlife Sanctuary, we do use at some lakes, but we're not proposing any right now at Cottage Grove and Dorena. Next slide, please. So this is a map showing those land classifications. And what we're doing for all the Willamette Valley master plans is a management by area approach. So we'll divide the lake into individual management units and then pick the primary classification for each unit. And like I said earlier, chapter 5 is going to go into a lot more detail for each individual management unit. It's important to note also, we can only classify land down to the shoreline. That shoreline we use is the maximum conservation pool, or your typical summertime pool level. We know that there are facilities like marinas or swim beaches that extend into the lake bed. We will describe them in chapter 5, but when it comes to classification, it either has to be the land classification or the surface water for boating purposes. Next slide, please. So I have a pie chart for this lake and for Dorena, and this is just to show you an overview to see what the previous master plan looked like and what our new master plan looks like. So we're proposing one new unit at Cottage Grove, and we're also using the new environmentally sensitive area classification. And this chart is showing percentages. So in terms of acreage at Cottage Grove, the total land area is about 400 acres. And the difference between the old plan and the new plan is about 45 acres. We've reduced 45 acres from operations and recreation while increasing that same amount into wildlife management and vegetation management. Next slide. And again, in chapter 8 of the document, you can find a more detailed summary of all the changes, but I wanted to give some high points here for Cottage Grove. So for operations, we've decreased some acreage there. This is primarily at the base of the dam, so it's the area near Piper Creek and the forested area along the Warehouser Road. We've moved both of those areas into the wildlife classification. For recreation, we made a change between the primitive campground and Wilson Creek. Previously, that was all high density recreation, but we created a new unit, the primitive prairie, and classified that as vegetation. But the other recreation areas remain the same in high density recreation, and that includes Pine Meadows, Lakeside, Short Ridge, Riverside, and Wilson Creek. So those will all remain high density recreation. For environmentally sensitive areas, we're proposing one new site at Sweeney Creek on the east side of the lake for various unique habitat types. And then for wildlife, I mentioned the little bit of increase near the dam operations unit, but the remainder of Sweeney Creek and London Creek are going to remain in that wildlife classification. And then vegetation, by splitting that primitive campground into the new primitive prairie unit, we feel that we've given more protection to the habitat restoration efforts that have gone on there, and we'll be able to continue those efforts. And then the West Shore unit will remain as a vegetation classification. Next slide. So now we're going to look at the surface water classifications. This map is showing in yellow the no wake zones, and then a very small red restricted area right by the dam, by the spillway. So it's important to realize that while we are proposing changes between the old plan and the new plan, the difference on the lake should not be noticeable, as all these areas have been marked with buoys and signs for years now. The mapping technology has improved since the 1980s. And so some of these areas were described in the old plan, but not necessarily mapped in the old plan. And so there is an overall reduction of 48 acres of open recreation, but that's primarily from either the mapping efforts or the small addition of the restricted area, 4 acres of restricted by the dam, and then 6 acres of no wake at the Powell Creek Cove that's just north of Short Ridge Park. All of the other no wake zones do remain the same, typically for safety purposes along the swim beaches or along boat ramps or the dam, and then for both safety and resource values at the upper end of the lake, where you just can't go very fast, where it's shallow. Next slide, please. So now let's move over to Dorena Lake. I have the same series of slides for that lake as well. We have one new unit here that's being proposed. It's the Dorena Hydro unit right at the base of the dam. And we're also proposing one environmentally sensitive area along the north shore line at Row Point. Next slide, please. So here are the charts for the overall difference between the old plan and the new plan at Dorena. So again, that one new unit being proposed. This unit is going to remain the same classification as project operations. We're just calling out the Dorena Hydropower LLC as its own management unit. And we're also using the environmentally sensitive area category that we had not used before. You'll notice there's a change though in the recreation amounts, and I'll explain that better on the next slide. So this chart is also by percentage. Land acreage wise, Dorena has about twice as much land, so it's just over 700 acres. And between the changes on the two plans, it is about 150 acres of difference with all the classifications. There are increases to wildlife management, high density recreation, and the future and inactive recreation, and then decreases to operations, vegetation management, and low density recreation. Next slide, please. All right, so the operational area changes that we've proposed, I mentioned Dorena Hydro being a new unit, but we also removed some of the forest, prairie, and wetland areas from that operational unit and moved them into a wildlife management unit. For recreation, it is not a one-for-one switch. This is a good one to look in Chapter 8 and see the maps and the differences. So Harms Park and Bake Stewart Park were added to high density recreation. They were different classifications in the 1980s. And then Vaughn Park was taken out of high density recreation and moved to the future or inactive recreation. That's currently a closed park. But Schwartz and Baker Bay will remain in that high density recreation category. And we're not proposing any new recreation sites at this time. For environmentally sensitive areas, the unit along the North Shore line at Row Point has been designated. It has very good prairie habitat and some oak habitat, and it's very similar to the adjacent lands and habitat restoration on the Cerro Gordo conservation land. For wildlife, we also, in addition to the units that were added by the dam, there's been improved mapping of the marshland and shoreland areas. So Teeter Creek and East Wildlife units will see some acreage changes. And then vegetation management, primarily the changes there have to do with better mapping of the shoreline, but the North Shore and South Shore will stay in that classification. Next slide. So here's the surface water classification map for Dorena. Again, you're not going to see changes on the ground from what is in the map. However, there will be differences between the old master plan and the new master plan. It's about a 48-acre difference as a reduction in open recreation. There is a restricted area near the dam itself by the spillway, and then slightly wider no-wake zones at Harms Park and at Baker Bay Park. But those areas do have buoys already, and they've been enforced for years. The other no-wake zones, like at the upper end of the lake in those areas, will all remain the same. Next slide. Okay, so that was a quick overview of all of the proposed changes with land and water classifications. I'd like to show you briefly how to access the documents. So there is a QR code on the screen. You can also Google Core Master Plan and Dorena, and it should get you right to the website as well. So this is the main master plan website, and as Christy mentioned, we're updating multiple master plans. So rather than link directly to the document, we would rather give everyone the link to the master plan website. So when we have a final document, we can upload it here as well. This meeting is being recorded, and it will also be uploaded to this website. So you will, as soon as you get to the website, Cottage Grove and Dorena is at the top of the page right now. And there's a link at the top that says click here to access the plan. That's where I have the arrow and the star on the screen. Next slide, please. So once you click that link, it will take you to a repository with the documents, and you can either view the document right there on that website, or you can download it to view offline. There are 2 separate PDF documents, one for the master plan and one for the environmental assessment. And the maps I showed earlier, they're in chapter 4 of the document with both the land and water classifications. But chapter 5 has the really detailed maps of each single management unit. So if you have a favorite area, that's the best place to go and look. And when you're on this site, it's fairly easy to navigate, but just make sure you look for those buttons to either view the document or download the document. Next slide. So finally, I'd like to give you information on how to submit your comments. Remember that we're not accepting comments through the chat feature during this meeting. So if you wrote something good in there, just copy it right now. You can paste it into an email. This is the email address down at the bottom of the screen there that you can submit your comments to. That is a long email address. So if you go directly to the website, you can just click the email link and it'll put it into a email program for you to make it easier to send. So we greatly appreciate your time to attend this public meeting. I really want to thank you for being here today. Your participation is very helpful to our process, and we really encourage you to review the document and to provide comments. If you have any general thoughts, you can definitely submit those comments and send us an email today. And then you can submit additional comments later after you review specific parts of the plan. If you have any photos or maps or reference links or anything like that, you can include that with your comment back to us. Just please make sure that all comments on the master plan or the environmental assessment are sent in by April 14th, please. So I know that was a quick overview of all of our proposed changes. We definitely invite you to review the document and the maps online for more details. And then what we plan to do now, we will stay online to be able to answer any questions that you may have. So if there are any questions in the chat, we can start to go through those. And then for those people that are phone only, after we get through the questions in the chat, we'll read off your phone numbers and see if you have any questions. Thank you, Molly, for putting information in there with the website link and also the email address to mail your questions to or your comments to. So there's a question in the chat right now. I wasn't able to catch all of your partners you consulted. Did that list include the Oregon Marine Board? It did include the Oregon State Marine Board. We discussed a lot of the potential closure areas, how things are currently working on the lake, how enforcement is going in those areas, any conflicts that they see with other boaters. They participated in some of the scoping meetings, but we've also had additional conversations with them. Both for Foster Green Peter and now for Cottage Grove and Dorena Lakes as well. Eric, I'm going to read this next question. I think it will be for you. WRDA of 2022 included a requirement report from the Army Corps to go to Congress regarding deauthorizing hydropower. What is the status of the delivery of the report to Congress? And then thank you for your presentation and your efforts.
Yeah, Drew, good question. So the Portland District completed that report on time, went up to the Assistant Secretary of the Army's office, and it remains hung up there. It did not get forwarded from the last administration. We're awaiting a new appointment of a new Assistant Secretary of the Army for Civil Works from this administration. and we're hopeful that it will go forward. That report was really to kind of discern the federal interest in generation of hydropower in the Willamette Valley, kind of a high-level view of that. And you're welcome on the presentation and efforts. Wendy, nice job. Thank you. Drew, if you have more questions on that issue or want to talk more, please reach out to me. And yeah, I can put my phone number in the chat if you'd like to individually. All right.
Thank you, Eric. I know we have 2 people that are phone only. It's fine to keep adding for if anyone still has questions or comments, please put them in the chat, but we'll go to a couple of the folks that we have on the phone. Diane, I believe you're the number ending in 22. Do you have any comments or questions?
Yes, I do have a question. I was wondering about these specific assessments of the mercury in the lake. Is that something that you're involved with as well, or is that another entity? And where do you know where I can find information with that?
Sure, I'll try to answer that first, and then if anyone else on the call wants to jump in. So the Superfund site and the mercury primarily is being handled by the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. Their Region 10 office has been doing sampling for the last 3 years at least in the reservoir. I realize they've been doing further upstream, they've been doing work for many years before that, but they've been sampling water quality and sediments and fish tissue and other types of things. There are 2 sections in the master plan document that will discuss that. There is a water quality section in chapter 2 that will go into a little bit of detail about the mercury from Black Butte mine, as well as just baseline mercury and the new state standards around mercury limits in water bodies. So there's that section in chapter 2, but also in chapter 6, that is a section of the document for special topics. So things that either would be repeated in multiple would be repeated in multiple management units, or it's just something unique about that lake. So we worked closely with the EPA and wrote up a section in chapter 6 specific about the Black Butte mine.
Great, thank you so much. Appreciate that.
You're welcome. Do you have any other questions?
I guess one other that comes to mind is the aspect of the blue-green algae. Is there a way, I guess, is there a way to watch a site or a daily site where we can keep up with that in terms of, you know, whether we use the lake or not, just to determine if there's something like that that is there and in the water?
Christy, are you able to answer that question about blue-green algae?
Yeah, I can do that. So I'm not sure how long you've lived in the area, but I think I want to say in the like 2013, 14, 15 time period, we were asked by the Oregon Health Authority to start monitoring blue-green algae blooms in our reservoirs. And they actually asked all of the water managing agencies in the state to do that. So not just the Corps, but everyone who managed a lake. And we did try for a few years to do that testing and monitoring. And it was very difficult especially with us managing 13 reservoirs, to be able to monitor at the level that we felt like was necessary to keep up the, what they had was an advisory program. So we would take tests, and if there was high levels of certain types of cyanobacteria, which is what blue-green algae is, then we would, we take the test, we'd send it out for results, we'd take a while to get the results, then we would give that information to Oregon Health Authority, and then they would issue an advisory. And what we found was that there was just too much delay in going out, collecting samples, getting results, but it would be days and days before the advisory would go up. And then, when the bloom would clear, we'd take another test and it would take some time to get the results for that. And then, then they would, take away the advisory. So the whole advisory program with letting people know about it, there was all these delays. And so we didn't really feel like it was helping keep the public safe because the information wasn't timely. And it was really not possible for us to take samples at every single area of every single lake. And so we didn't want the public to have a sense of security that this advisory program was giving them all the information that they really needed. And so we chose to take a different approach where we would just do it through education. We put signs up that were year round that say, when in doubt, stay out. Put out a lot of educational information about what a bloom looks like and what the potential safety hazards are so that people could make a decision based on their own observations to make a decision whether or not they wanted to go in the water. So what I'm all trying to say is, no, there is not a place where you can go and get information to find out whether or not there is a bloom. And so, because it just is not a program that could be kept up with the resources that we had.
Okay, thank you so much for answering that. Are there any visual signs that I might be able to see before I entered water, like anything that would alert me that there may be a bloom? And perhaps that might be something I can research on a website as well.
Yeah, there are, the Oregon Health Authority does have a web page. They call it HABs, harmful algae blooms. So if you go to the Oregon Health Authority and you search there, they have a website, a web section, several pages about what a bloom looks like, what the concerns might be. For example, pets are more susceptible to the toxins than people in some cases. It's really helpful. The pictures, and yes, the answer to your question is yes. You visually usually can see if there is a bloom. You can see the water is discolored. There's a lot of times there's scum on the water, and that's why we say when in doubt, stay out. Many of the blooms are not. Through the testing that we did, we never actually found toxins that were high enough in many of the, well, I guess I shouldn't say we never did, but we most of the time we did not find toxins that would be harmful to people. But still, we still feel that if the water is discolored, if it looks scummy, you probably shouldn't go in it.
Great. Thank you so much for all your efforts and answering the question. Really appreciate you.
Welcome.
All right, we have one other phone only caller. The area code is 503 and the number ends in 80. Would you like to come off of mute and ask any comments or questions? Sometimes it takes a minute for the unmute to happen. If you're having trouble, if you hit *6 on your phone, it should unmute you. Okay, I'm not seeing anyone else that is a phone only. Again, if you're having trouble with your audio right now, you can use this email address on the main Army Corps website, the master plan website. Send us an email if you have a question and we can try to answer that for you. All right, I'm going to see if there's any other questions in the chat. Thank you, Eric, for posting the website and the contact information for the Superfund site. And Diane, if you want to send an email to the master plan email address, we can get a copy of that information to you.
Great. Thank you so much. Appreciate that.
And then Christy put in a link to the Oregon Health Authority website for information about the harmful algae blooms. So we'll get that to you as well.
Great, thank you. Appreciate that.
All right. Is there anyone that wants to use the raise hand feature or come off of mute and ask a question instead of typing it in?
Hi, this is Tom Powers, and I scanned the document already before this meeting, and I was unable to find some information I was looking for. I'm not going to bore you right now with asking about that information, but is there someone I can contact to find out more information about specifically what I'm looking for?
And if you you can either stay on late on this call and I can try to get that, or you can email that main email address there and I should be able to give you exactly what sections and chapters you might be able to find it in.
Okay, thank you. I'll stay on late then.
Okay, wonderful. Anyone else that would like to ask a question? Okay, not hearing any. I want to thank you all for coming today. That'll conclude our presentation. This meeting recording will be posted on the website. And so if anybody was interested and missed this, we can direct them to the website and they can watch the recording. Thank you all.